The shogun Ieyasu was a shrewd judge of men, but had a curiously casual way of employing some persons. He used talent wherever he saw it. Thus he employed a falconer on diplomatic missions and an actor as director of his mining operations because they had a flair for those things. It was by a strange accident that he found one of his most valuable experts, a shipbuilder, Will Adams, pilot major of a small Dutch flotilla, who was one of a few survivors of a typhoon which severely damaged the flagship, the Liefde. This little group of foreign sailors landed in Kyushu, and in due course Ieyasu came to hear of Will Adams. He was a native of Kent in England, and had served a thorough apprenticeship as a shipwright. He built several small ships for Ieyasu and explained Western methods of navigation. He arranged for the salvaged guns and ammunition of the Liefde to be used in the siege of Osaka Castle. Ieyasu admired Adams' determination and native shrewdness, and held frequent conversations with him. In the course of their discussions, Adams persuaded Ieyasu to grant the English trade privileges, a move which commended itself to Ieyasu, who was anxious for competition to offset the Portuguese monopoly. Adams warned him against the potential dangers of relations with Spain and Portugal, and pointed out that there were other European nations, England among them, who did not insist on propagating their faith, but were content with trading privileges alone. The Dutch received permission to trade in 1609. The British East India Company was at this point offered a gilt-edged opportunity to acquire a favoured trading position, but the company official in charge, possibly jealous of Will Adams, selected an unsuitable site for his trading station against Adams' advice. The British factory never really prospered and was closed down after some years, leaving the Dutch the only gainers from the whole affair. Will Adams acquired a considerable estate and married a Japanese wife. He ultimately died in Japan, somewhat homesick for England but full of honours, and is commemorated by a monument that looks out over the sea, which was his livelihood and his sorrow. It was this passage in W.S. Morton's wonderful Japanese history book that convinced me to go looking for the monument mentioned here. For 15 summers ago, I stayed in an apartment not 1,000 yards from here, and heard from various sources that the monument of which Morton wrote was a couple of short miles away. So I got on the rickety bicycle that I bought for the summer and cycled down those 2 or 3 miles as the crow flies, yet found that these 2 or 3 miles were mainly up a very, very steep hill to find the monument dedicated to Adams at a hilltop called Anjinzuka. When I got there, I saw something that resembled a gravestone, so I assumed it was the grave of Adams. And I felt a special connection, I don't know why. Probably because it was a monument to an Englishman abroad in Japan as I was, even though I was set to go home a few short weeks later to begin graduate school. But I felt in my heart that one day I'd be back in Japan and back at that monument. And so, many years later, my circumstances were so that I returned here within 2 or 3 miles of the famous monument to Will Adams, and my interest in his life and his story resumed. I tried to study more about him, but I found that stories about Adams were quite repetitive. He was born in Kent. He became a shipbuilder, a navigator. He sailed with the Dutch fleet westwards around the world, reached as far as Japan, landing on the beaches after a storm. His life was in peril for a short time. From the Portuguese and Spanish Jesuits and the samurai themselves, this was a time of turmoil in Japan. But luckily for Adams, he was taken for an audience with Japan's most powerful warlord, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and Adams impressed Ieyasu greatly. Adams showed Ieyasu how to use the cannons from his ship, which Ieyasu utilised, helping him to become shogun in a few short years. It's well documented that Adams was a trusted advisor. He built Western-style ships for Ieyasu. He was given an estate where the monument stands today. He was given the title of Hatamoto, a high-ranking samurai title. He built an English factory for trade in the south of Japan, in Kyushu, near Nagasaki, but it didn't flourish. And there he died of fever. But according to his wishes, so the legend goes, Will Adams' son buried him on the hilltop where the monument now stands. But how much of the story of Will Adams has passed from a tale of a real man and a real life into legend? The more I study, the more I realise that not everything we assume about Will Adams can be taken for granted. Japan was closed for 250 years, and when British tradesmen and amateur historians came looking for Will Adams' domain, they thought they'd found his grave until they opened it and found nothing inside. And also all trace of his family, his wife and Japanese children, had been lost. And that remained the story of Will Adams until very, very recently, when a grave was opened at the place of his death, Hirado, and the bones of a Westerner were found inside. This shows that despite the legend that Adams was buried in Tsukiyama Park, in Hemi, just south of where I am now, it was no more than a legend. And the more I study of Will Adams, the more I realise there is not just so much more to learn, but there is so much to unlearn. And in doing so, I hope I can get closer to the real story of the life and times of Will Adams and the fate of him and his family in Japan. So the remains of Will Adams that have been found have been positively identified as the remains of a Western European. So now, under the direction of the Mayor of Hirado and scientists, the search is underway to find English relations of Will Adams to make a positive identification. But what I also think is it's possible, if those remains are those of Will Adams, to determine whether or not his family survived and thrived in Japan. Will Adams lived in an age of great navigators, discoverers and adventurers, and even in an age of Raleigh, Drake, Frobisher, he deserves a seat at the top table. But this series is not just a rehash of things we already know about Will Adams. It is a search for new information. And now is a very exciting time to undertake this search, because the Mayor of Hirado in Kyushu, the site of Will Adams' death, has decreed he wants to make a positive identification of the grave remains by April the 24th, 2020, the 400th anniversary of Will Adams' death. This year-long documentary series will run right through to that moment when we will find out whether or not the Mayor of Hirado's quest is successful. And then I will collate all the clips that I've put on YouTube in the search for Will Adams to make a new documentary series. In Search of the Lost English Samurai.